What major event marked the beginning of the 20th century historically? The unification of Germany in 1871. Which country emerged as a world power during the early 20th century? The United States. Who was the Russian ruler overthrown in the Russian Revolution of 1917? Tsar Nicholas II. What triggered the outbreak of World War I in 1914? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In which year did the Boxer Rebellion in China occur? In the year 1900. Who led the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia? Vladimir Lenin. What treaty formally ended World War I? Treaty of Versailles. Which event marked the beginning of the Great Depression in 1929? The Wall Street crash. Who was the fascist dictator of Italy during World War II? Benito Mussolini. Who established a communist dictatorship in the Soviet Union after Lenin's death? Joseph Stalin. In what year did Adolf Hitler become Chancellor of Germany? In the year 1933. Which Asian country invaded China in 1937, leading to a prolonged conflict? Japan. What event led directly to the United States' entry into World War II? The attack on Pearl Harbor. Which two Japanese cities were targeted by atomic bombs in 1945? Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What organization was founded in 1945 to maintain global peace? The United Nations. Who led the independence movement in India during the 20th century? Mahatma Gandhi. When did India gain independence from British rule? In the year 1947. Which conflict marked the beginning of the Cold War era in Asia in 1950? The Korean War. Who was the leader of Communist China after the Chinese Civil War? Mao Zedong. What European city was blockaded by the Soviets in 1948, prompting a massive airlift? Berlin. What doctrine advocated U.S. economic assistance to rebuild Europe after World War II? The Marshall Plan. Which Middle Eastern nation was established in 1948? Israel. What was the primary aim of NATO, founded in 1949? To provide collective security against the Soviet Union. What year did the Suez Crisis occur, marking a significant Middle Eastern conflict? In the year 1956. Which Soviet leader initiated the policy of the Stalinization in the 1950s? Nikita Khrushchev. What 1962 event brought the world close to nuclear war? The Cuban Missile Crisis. Who was the revolutionary leader of Cuba who came to power in 1959? Fidel Castro. When did the Vietnam War officially end? In the year 1975. Which US president resigned due to the Watergate scandal? Richard Nixon. Who became the first president of independent Ghana in 1957? Kwame Nkrumah. Which country underwent a violent cultural revolution between 1966 and 1976? China. Who was South Africa's first black president, elected in 1994? Nelson Mandela. What year did the Berlin Wall fall, symbolizing the end of the Cold War? In the year 1989. Which country invaded Afghanistan in 1979, starting a prolonged conflict? The Soviet Union. Who succeeded Mao Zedong as China's leader and initiated economic reforms? Deng Xiaoping. Which war resulted from Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990? The Gulf War. Who led the Solidarity movement in Poland? Lech Walesa. When did the Soviet Union collapse, ending communist rule there? In the year 1991. Which two countries were involved in the Falklands War of 1982? Argentina and Britain. What tragic event occurred in Rwanda in 1994? The Rwandan genocide. Who was the British Prime Minister during the majority of World War II? Winston Churchill. What term describes the political, economic, and military rivalry between the US and Soviet Union? The Cold War. Which Asian nation became an economic powerhouse known for its rapid growth in the post-World War II era? Japan. Who became the first democratically elected president of Russia in 1991? Boris Yeltsin. Which war was described as the war to end all wars? World War I. What ideological conflict defined global politics from roughly 1945 to 1991? Communism vs capitalism, the Cold War. Which European nation was divided after World War II until reunification in 1990? Germany. Which Southeast Asian country experienced genocide under Pol Pot's regime? Cambodia. Which global health crisis emerged in the 1980s, severely affecting Africa? HIV/AIDS epidemic. Which president led the United States during the majority of World War II? Franklin D. Roosevelt. Who succeeded Stalin as the leader of the Soviet Union? Nikita Khrushchev. What year did the Spanish Civil War begin? In the year 1936. Who became Egypt's leader after the revolution of 1952? Jamal Abdel Nasser. In which conflict did the US face a significant defeat in Southeast Asia in 1975? Vietnam War. Who was the first Prime Minister of independent India? Jawaharlal Nehru. What agreement ended American involvement in the Vietnam War in 1973? Paris Peace Accords. Which country's revolution in 1979 resulted in the establishment of an Islamic Republic? Iran. Who was the communist leader of North Vietnam? Ho Chi Minh. What strategy aimed to prevent the spread of communism during the Cold War? Containment. Which leader introduced perestroika and glasnost in the Soviet Union? Mikhail Gorbachev. What event initiated World War II in Europe in 1939? Germany's invasion of Poland. Who was Britain's first female Prime Minister? Margaret Thatcher. Which African country experienced apartheid until the early 1990s? South Africa. When did Hong Kong return to Chinese control? In the year 1997. Which two countries were involved in the Six-Day War in 1967? Israel and Egypt, alongside Syria and Jordan. What US policy provided aid to anti-communist countries post-World War II? The Truman Doctrine. Who was president during the Cuban Missile Crisis? John F. Kennedy. Which Middle Eastern conflict began in 1980 and lasted 8 years? The Iran-Iraq War. Who led Yugoslavia until his death in 1980? Joseph Broz Tito. Which African leader ruled Zimbabwe from independence until 2017? Robert Mugabe. What was the main cause of the 1973 global energy crisis? OPEC oil embargo. What event sparked the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989? Demands for political reform and freedom of speech. Which European country faced ethnic conflict and civil war after its breakup in the 1990s? Yugoslavia. Which American civil rights leader was assassinated in 1968? Martin Luther King Jr. Who was president during the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003? George W. Bush. When was the European Union officially established by the Maastricht Treaty? In the year 1993. Which U.S. city was targeted in a significant terrorist attack on September 11, 2001? New York City. What global pandemic struck in 1918, killing millions? Spanish flu pandemic. What was the purpose of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944? To establish international monetary cooperation post-World War II. Which African country faced a devastating famine in the mid-1980s? Ethiopia. Who was the leader of Iraq during both the Gulf War and the Iraq War? Saddam Hussein. When did apartheid officially end in South Africa? In the year 1994. Who was US President at the end of World War I? Woodrow Wilson. Which island nation faced severe economic problems and dictatorship under Fidel Castro? Cuba. Who was Britain's Prime Minister during the Suez Crisis? Anthony Eden. What major economic alliance formed in Europe in 1957? The European Economic Community, EEC. Who was the first Secretary General of the United Nations? Trygve. What Asian nation achieved independence from the Netherlands in 1949? Indonesia. Who was the longest-serving president of France's Fifth Republic? Charles de Gaulle. Which country faced violent separatism by Chechen rebels in the 1990s? Russia. Who succeeded Franklin D. Roosevelt as President of the United States in 1945? Harry S. Truman. What was the principal aim of the Warsaw Pact, established in 1955? To counterbalance NATO and provide collective defense for Soviet bloc countries. Who was the Egyptian president assassinated in 1981? Anwar Sadat. What Middle Eastern peace accords were brokered by President Jimmy Carter in 1978? Camp David Accords. What year did the partition of India occur? In the year 1947. Who was the British Prime Minister known for his policy of appeasement towards Hitler? Neville Chamberlain. Which international organization replaced the League of Nations after World War II? The United Nations. Who became the communist leader of Cuba after the revolution in 1959? Fidel Castro. Which country gained independence from Britain and experienced a violent civil war in the 1960s? Nigeria. What was the official name of West Germany from 1949 to 1990? Federal Republic of Germany. Who was the first female Prime Minister of India? Indira Gandhi. Which European city was divided by a wall from 1961 until 1989? Berlin. What year did the Korean War end with an armistice? In the year 1953. Which African country was known as Rhodesia before gaining independence in 1980? Zimbabwe. Which British Prime Minister resigned following the Brexit referendum in 2016? David Cameron. What economic alliance preceded the European Union? European Economic Community, EEC. Who led the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979? Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Which Asian country was ruled by military leader General Suharto for over 3 decades? Indonesia. What was the major international crisis involving hostages held in Iran beginning in 1979? Iran hostage crisis. Which Latin American country experienced a military dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet? Chile. Who was president during the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in 2001? George W. Bush. What term describes the rapid economic expansion experienced by Japan after World War II? The Japanese economic miracle. Which event initiated direct US military involvement in Vietnam? Gulf of Tonkin Incident, 1964. Who became Chancellor of West Germany in 1949, guiding its post-war reconstruction? Konrad Adenauer. What movement fought against racial segregation and discrimination in the United States? The Civil Rights Movement. Which war ended French colonial rule in Indochina in 1954? First Indochina War. Who was the communist leader who reunified Vietnam in 1975? Le Duan. Which organization was established in 1960 by oil-producing countries? OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Who was president of Russia after Vladimir Putin's first 2 terms ended in 2008? Dmitry Medvedev. What major economic change did Deng Xiaoping introduce in China? Market-oriented economic reforms. Which European country had a Velvet Revolution in 1989? Czechoslovakia. Who was the dictator overthrown in Libya during the Arab Spring in 2011? Muammar Gaddafi. What was the main consequence of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918? Russia excited World War I. Which American president declared a war on terror after 9/11? George W. Bush. Who was the longest-serving leader of the Soviet Union during the Cold War after Stalin? Leonid Brezhnev. Which Latin American country was led by Juan Perón after World War II? Argentina. Which disease caused a major global pandemic starting in 2019? COVID-19. Who became Prime Minister of Britain during the early years of the Great Depression? Ramsay MacDonald. Which 2 countries signed the Treaty of Rapallo in 1922? Germany and Soviet Russia. Who was the German Chancellor who oversaw the reunification of Germany in 1990? Helmut Kohl. Which Asian nation fought a war with the Soviet Union in 1939? Japan. Which country was ruled by General Francisco Franco from 1939 to 1975? Who became President of France in 1958 and established the Fifth Republic? Charles de Gaulle. What 1995 peace agreement aimed to end ethnic conflict in Bosnia? Dayton Accords. Who was the last leader of the Soviet Union? Mikhail Gorbachev. Which country's communist regime collapsed during the Romanian Revolution in 1989? Romania. What event in 1915 is widely considered a genocide by the Ottoman Empire? The Armenian Genocide. Who was the military dictator of Uganda from 1971 to 1979? Idi Amin. What event prompted Britain's entry into World War I? Germany's invasion of Belgium. Who was Prime Minister of Britain at the outbreak of World War I? Herbert Henry Asquith. Which war ended British control over the American colonies? American Revolutionary War. Who succeeded Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister of the UK in 1990? John Major. Which country experienced a communist revolution in 1978 leading to Soviet invasion? Afghanistan. Who was the leader of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia? Pol Pot. Which country was partitioned at independence in 1947 into two separate states? India. Who became President of South Africa after Nelson Mandela? Thabo Mbeki. What was the military alliance of Eastern European countries during the Cold War? Warsaw Pact. Which Israeli Prime Minister was assassinated in 1995? Yitzhak Rabin. Who became the first President of independent Kenya in 1964? Jomo Kenyatta. What was the international response to South Africa's apartheid policy in the 1980s? Sanctions and economic boycotts. Which US President was responsible for the Great Society social reforms? Lyndon B. Johnson. Who was the first leader of independent Indonesia? Sukarno. Which country became independent from Portugal in 1975 after a long colonial war? Angola. Who was the first president of the Palestinian Authority? Yasser Arafat. Which Asian country experienced a significant famine under Kim Il-sung? North Korea. Who became leader of China in 2012, ushering in significant changes? Xi Jinping. What major conflict occurred between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006? In 2006 Lebanon War. Which country annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014? Russia. Who was the Egyptian president during the Arab Spring protests of 2011? Hosni Mubarak. What 1998 peace agreement aimed to resolve the conflict in Northern Ireland? Good Friday Agreement. Which American president pursued the policy of détente with the Soviet Union? Richard Nixon. Who was Prime Minister of Britain during World War II end? Clement Attlee. What was the name of the military strategy Germany used in World War II involving rapid advances? Blitzkrieg. Who led Pakistan after a military coup in 1999? Pervez Musharraf. Which Central American country experienced a revolution led by the Sandinistas in 1979? Nicaragua. Who was Prime Minister of Israel during the Six-Day War in 1967? Levi Eshkol. What international conflict erupted after the dissolution of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s? Yugoslav Wars. Who became President of Egypt after the 2011 revolution? Mohammad Morsi. Which Soviet leader was in power during the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979? Leonid Brezhnev. What major international agreement aimed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions was signed in 2015? Paris Agreement. Which Asian country fought a war against Pakistan in 1971, resulting in the creation of Bangladesh? India. Who became US President after Ronald Reagan? George H.W. Bush. What peace treaty ended World War II in Europe in 1945? Germany's unconditional surrender, no formal treaty, but known as Victory in Europe Day. Who was Prime Minister of India during the economic liberalization reforms of 1991? P.V. Narasimha Rao. Which US President established diplomatic relations with Communist China? Richard Nixon. Who was the British monarch during both World Wars? King George V during World War I and King George V during World War II. What year did the Chernobyl nuclear disaster occur? In the year 1986. Who became President of France after Charles de Gaulle? Georges Pompidou. Which country did Iraq invade in 1990, leading to the Gulf War? Kuwait. Who was the US President at the end of the Vietnam War in 1975? Gerald Ford. What year did apartheid officially begin in South Africa? In the year 1948. Who succeeded Indira Gandhi as Prime Minister of India after her assassination in 1984? Rajiv Gandhi. Which Asian country gained independence from Pakistan in 1971? Bangladesh. Who was the Prime Minister of Canada during the October crisis of 1970? Pierre Trudeau. What event sparked the Arab Spring in December 2010? Self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia. Who was the leader of Libya before Muammar Gaddafi came to power? King Idris I. Which conflict was ended by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923? Turkish War of Independence. Who led the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia? Václav Havel. Which country was invaded by Soviet troops in 1956 to suppress a revolution? Hungary. What was the name given to the economic reforms initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev? Perestroika. Who was the British Prime Minister at the start of World War II? Neville Chamberlain. What was the International Military Tribunal held to prosecute Nazi war criminals after World War II? Nuremberg Trials. Who was the American general overseeing post-war Japan's occupation? Douglas MacArthur. What was the military alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan called in World War II? The Axis powers. Which African nation gained independence from Belgium in 1960, leading to immediate turmoil? Congo, now Democratic Republic of Congo. Who was the Egyptian leader who nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956? Jamal Abdel Nasser. Which international crisis involved the US Embassy seizure in Tehran in 1979? Iran hostage crisis. Who succeeded Leonid Brezhnev as the Soviet Union's leader? Yuri Andropov. What year was Israel established? In the year 1948. Who was the first president of post-Soviet independent Russia? Boris Yeltsin. What event in 1968 involved Soviet intervention to suppress reforms? Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. Which African country was first to gain independence from European colonialism in 1957? Ghana. Who was the dictator overthrown in the 1979 Nicaraguan Revolution? Anastasio Somoza Debayle. What 20th century conflict involved proxy wars between the USA and USSR? The Cold War. Who was President of the United States during World War I? Woodrow Wilson. Which Asian country was known as Siam until 1939? Thailand. Who was the leader of the Soviet Union during World War II? Joseph Stalin. What year did the Cuban Revolution successfully overthrow Batista? In the year 1959. Which South African president initiated the end of apartheid by freeing Nelson Mandela? F.W. de Klerk. What was the 1942 battle marking the turning point in North Africa during World War II? The Battle of El Alamein. Who became US President after Franklin Roosevelt's death in 1945? Harry S. Truman. Which war saw Argentina and the UK fighting over island territories in 1982? The Falklands War. Who became the Prime Minister of Japan responsible for the post-World War II economic recovery? Shigeru Yoshida. What was the uprising against Soviet control in East Germany in 1953? East German Uprising. Who led Italy's post-war recovery and integration into NATO? Alcide de Gasperi. Which South American dictator was overthrown in Chile in 1990? Augusto Pinochet. Who was the US President at the beginning of the Great Depression? Herbert Hoover. Which war involved US intervention in the Dominican Republic in 1965? Dominican Civil War. Who was the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany? Konrad Adenauer. Which European treaty established NATO? North Atlantic Treaty, 1949. Who was the Vietnamese leader who defeated French colonial forces in 1954? Ho Chi Minh. What was the significant battle where Vietnamese forces defeated French troops in 1954? Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Which global health crisis began in the early 1980s, affecting millions worldwide? HIV/AIDS pandemic. Who was the British Prime Minister during the General Strike of 1926? Stanley Baldwin. Which Chinese leader implemented the Great Leap Forward? Mao Zedong. Who became British Prime Minister after Winston Churchill's retirement in 1955? Anthony Eden. What was the massacre in 1919 that intensified Indian demands for independence? Jallianwala Bagh, Amritsar, massacre. Who was the British Governor General who oversaw India's independence? Lord Mountbatten. What was the American policy aimed at stopping communism's spread in the 1940s? Containment. Who was the Israeli leader during the 1973 Yom Kippur War? Golda Meir. What major Middle Eastern war occurred in 1967? Six-Day War. Which leader unified Vietnam after the Vietnam War ended? Le Duan. Who was President of the United States during the Bay of Pigs invasion? John F. Kennedy. What international agreement limited the nuclear arms race between the US and USSR in 1972? Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT-I. Who led the Polish Solidarity movement in the 1980s? Lech Walesa. Which event in 1955 aimed at addressing relations between colonial and newly independent nations? Bandung Conference, Asian-African Conference. Who was the leader of Yugoslavia during the Kosovo War in 1999? Slobodan Milosevic. What international treaty sought to eliminate chemical weapons globally in 1993? Chemical Weapons Convention. Who was the British Prime Minister during the Iraq War beginning in 2003? Tony Blair. What was the primary aim of the Kyoto Protocol signed in 1997? Reduce greenhouse gas emissions to combat climate change. Who was the first president of independent Algeria? Ahmed Ben Bella. Which European country experienced a civil war from 1946 to 1949, involving communist rebels? Greece. Who became Prime Minister of Canada in 2015? Justin Trudeau. What was the primary reason for the Berlin airlift of 1948? 1949. Soviet blockade of West Berlin. Who was the first African American president of the United States? Barack Obama. What was the military strategy used by NATO during the Kosovo conflict in 1999? Air Campaign, Operation Allied Force. Who was Prime Minister of India during the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War? Indira Gandhi. Which Central Asian country was invaded by the Soviet Union in 1979? Afghanistan. Who became the first Prime Minister of Israel? David Ben-Gurion. Which event ended the Russian monarchy in 1917? February Revolution. Who was President of France during the Algerian War of Independence? Charles de Gaulle. What year marked the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union? In the year 1991. Who was the Cuban leader ousted by Fidel Castro's revolution? Fulgencio Batista. Which African country saw genocide against the Tutsi minority in 1994? Rwanda. Who was the President of the United States during the Korean War outbreak? Harry S. Truman. What was the period of ideological conflict between capitalism and communism after World War II known as the Cold War? Who was Prime Minister of Australia during World War II? John Curtin. Which Latin American country faced a severe economic crisis and hyperinflation in the 2000s under Hugo Chavez? Venezuela. Who was Prime Minister of Israel during the Camp David Accords in 1978? Menahem Begin. Who was the founder of modern Turkey after the fall of the Ottoman Empire? Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Which British Prime Minister led Britain into the Suez Crisis? Anthony Eden. What conflict involved the US supporting the Contras against the Sandinistas in the 1980s Nicaraguan Civil War? Who was the last Shah of Iran before the Islamic Revolution? Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Which country was invaded by the US in 1989 to remove dictator Manuel Noriega? Panama. Who became Prime Minister of Pakistan after Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's execution? Mohammad Zia-ul Haq. What event triggered US involvement in World War II? Attack on Pearl Harbor. Who succeeded Winston Churchill as British Prime Minister in 1945? Clement Attlee. What year did Hong Kong return to Chinese sovereignty? In the year 1997. Who was the leader of Indonesia during its independence struggle against the Dutch? Sukarno. Which military alliance was established in 1955 as a counterpart to NATO? Warsaw Pact. What was the conflict between Argentina and the UK in 1982 known as the Falklands War? Who became the president of Russia after Boris Yeltsin resigned in 1999? Vladimir Putin. Which Southeast Asian country was the site of a major genocide under the Khmer Rouge? Cambodia. Who led the Free French forces during World War II? Charles de Gaulle. What was the official racial segregation policy of South Africa known as apartheid? Who was the first Prime Minister of independent Ghana? Kwame Nkrumah. Which Asian country was ruled by Ferdinand Marcos until 1986? The Philippines. Who was leader of North Vietnam during the Vietnam War? Ho Chi Minh. What economic union formed in Europe in 1957? European Economic Community, EEC. Who became Chancellor of Germany after Helmut Kohl? Gerhard Schröder. What was the major 1968 Soviet invasion to suppress democratic reforms? Prague Spring. Who was the US President during the Gulf of Tonkin incident? Lyndon B. Johnson. What war was ended by the Paris Peace Accords in 1973? Vietnam War. Who became President of Egypt after Anwar Sadat's assassination in 1981? Hosni Mubarak. What major disease epidemic spread globally in the 1980s? HIV, AIDS. Who was Britain's Prime Minister during World War I? David Lloyd George. What event in 1962 nearly escalated into a nuclear conflict? Cuban Missile Crisis. Who became the first female Chancellor of Germany? Angela Merkel. Which European country's communist regime fell during the Velvet Revolution? Czechoslovakia. Who became US President after John F. Kennedy's assassination? Lyndon B. Johnson. What was the primary objective of the Marshall Plan? European economic recovery post-World War II. Who was Prime Minister of Israel during the Oslo Accords? Yitzhak Rabin. Which country did India fight a war with in 1962? China. Who was the leader of communist Yugoslavia until 1980? Josip Broz Tito. Which 1980-88 war involved two Middle Eastern nations? Iran-Iraq War. Who was Prime Minister of Britain at the beginning of World War II? Neville Chamberlain. Which Chinese leader launched the Cultural Revolution? Mao Zedong. What treaty ended the state of war between Egypt and Israel in 1979? Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty.